Representative O'Neill, you look like you are prepared for the cool weather.
Yeah, I'm sitting on the side of my house where the wind comes through, and it's a little chilly sometimes.
Indeed. I usually go through kind of the same thing each fall with my office here. We have to adjust the temperature up a degree or two. It just seems to be one of the quirks of the large building heating systems.
Yes. Well, also our heating bills are supposed to go up 30%, 50%, 60%, something. So there's that to look forward to.
Yeah, I saw that in the one I just paid this month already to our friends at Excel Energy.
So good afternoon, everyone. A little smaller group now. We do have the POR crimes subgroup meeting this afternoon. Let me see right here. Was there anything you had, Olivia, to start out with?
No, thank you.
Okay. Sheriff Heck.
I'll just mention that Angie, you're going to be on the spot for the second half of the meeting as a chair because I do have to leave at 2.
Okay. And then Angie.
I don't have anything in particular. Maybe there won't be a second half.
That it seems to be a hectic afternoon for a lot of people. So the crime subgroup is covering those areas, which crimes end up triggering registration. I think the last discussion that was had clearly noted that the list of crimes isn't in question, with the exception of the false imprisonment, where there was discussion of limiting that false imprisonment as a triggered registration offense. That seemed to be the big issue that was being covered by the group.
Am I remembering correctly, Mark, that we've presented the language proposals to this entire subgroup on that change?
Yes, and there was the discussion, I think Angie had the different versions of what possibly could put that limitation in there. That was the language that you had originally submitted as options on that.
Yeah, I think I think Mark shared all 3. You had done some language changing, false imprisonment itself, and then the language moving it out of same set of circumstances. And I think generally the one moving it out of same set of circumstances was the one that we thought probably would most easily kind of accomplish what people had talked about being concerned about with the false imprisonment. And I think people also, between the ones rewriting false imprisonment itself, I think that they like the one that to have the domestic one maybe separated out. I can't remember. I know the other one we were thinking was kind of redundant, which is why we took the false imprisonment out.
Yeah, did you want to look at that language again? Here, Representative O'Neill. Doesn't seem to be. Is Kendra there, or maybe Brian can unmute?
I just got unmuted.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. So since Ashley is here from Mincasa, I know she's a member of the public, but I have a question. for her, and since she represents organizations that represent victims so much, wondering what her thoughts are about, if she has any knowledge about removing that part of law in this process about false imprisonment. And realizing that it's different than kidnapping, right? But if she has any thoughts about that as a victim's rights advocate.
So unless there's objection from either of the chairs, Ashley, you can
I
address
have
the
an
question.
objection, but Ashley, were you here for those, just present for the discussions about making false imprisonment require a conviction or require registration for a conviction only versus same set of circumstances? Were you present for those discussions?
I probably was. To say that I remember everything about this, the discussion is probably another question, but
So just before you answer, I think, I mean, the main issue about that is the number of cases where false imprisonment is charged as part of a domestic assault situation, or even like let's say like a robbery situation, and people plead to the domestic assault and the false imprisonment is dismissed, or they plead to the robbery and the false imprisonment is dismissed, and they have to register because of the same set of circumstances. So the discussion was, is there a way to kind of get those kind of offenses off the registry and still keep the, false imprisonment, or the more probably targeted false imprisonment on the registry? So what do you think from a victim perspective, as far as those other ones coming off would end up coming off the registry?
yeah, and I've thought a lot about this. I guess, because I'm trying to think about like, when did I see these cases, and knowing that I see a certain segment of the population, and that's very much like my experience working with victim survivors, that when I did work with victim survivors who were in false imprisonment situations, it was a really dangerous, very lethal situation where someone was made to feel like they couldn't leave their house, couldn't leave a room. So I kind of carry that with me. And of course, like, while domestic violence and sexual violence have some different aspects to them, there is, when we're looking at who is committing sexual violence, like, we know that we're more likely to be assaulted by, somebody, in a domestic relationship, perhaps with them. So I think, I guess I'm kind of waffling back and forth here, because I also understand that there might be other circumstances where someone is being charged with false imprisonment that aren't like the situations that I've seen. But yeah, I guess I will say that I definitely have seen false imprisonment be related to the issue. I don't know if that's necessarily, am I being helpful with my response here? Is that what you were hoping to get from me?
Representative O'Neill, can you unmute her?
I just did. Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, that was my concern, and the reason I asked her that, and we don't have violence-free Minnesota. Yeah, I think that's what they're called now. Sorry, they changed their name, and with COVID, I'm still trying to catch up with everything. But since we don't have a representative from Violence-Free Minnesota that's even closer tied to this situation, when you've got a domestic violence situation and a false imprisonment, that's why I asked Ashley, because she's from Mincasa, which is, as she said, it's a little bit different, but still fairly close to related. If I can tell you at the legislature that if the victims' rights advocates or victims themselves, victim survivors, come and testify their concern, because it's so difficult to kind of tease out unless we can very clearly tease that out. Like you said, a burglary or something, or a robbery, I should say, something like that. I don't know. It wouldn't move forward in the legislature because we are so concerned about victims of crime that if there's several situations where they work hand in hand, so then it just is going to be very difficult to move it forward, which is why I asked for that.
Yeah, I guess I'll add that I think if it's being removed, I have gotten concerned with the way it's been talked about as like, oh, this is a domestic violence issue. It's not related to sexual violence. Like, I don't think, to me, that doesn't really hold up because I think these two things like are related. So I've had some, I guess, concerns about that messaging, you know, and then, you know, on the flip side, like I have, you know, some other just kind of thoughts about the registry in itself that I think I've kind of made clear in this, like through other comments. So I just kind of caution against the messaging that we're going to take this off because it's domestic violence related and therefore not related to sexual violence, because that's not true in my experiences.
Sheriff Heck.
I do certainly understand the thoughts Ashley has about the relationship and kind of the conversation, maybe minimizing the idea of false imprisonment. I certainly don't want to give that impression. I think that in my mind, the change that's being proposed isn't intended to minimize the crime that's involved here. It's merely a tool to give the justice system a way to kind of differentiate between the folks that should be included on a predatory offender registration because of the offenses that they're committing that's involved with false imprisonment, and the folks that committed a serious offense that isn't necessarily what was envisioned for inclusion on the predatory offender registry. And so that by removing that automatic requirement to register because that charge was included, that moves that decision down along to the court process where the prosecutor, the defense, and the judge, and ultimately the jury could decide whether or not that charge is appropriate. And if the conviction was secured, then that person would definitely be on the registry. But I think in my mind, this is just a tool to kind of more tightly refine who does and who does not appear on the predatory offender registry, because this crime definitely crosses over a lot of aspects that might or might not be related to the purpose of the registry.
Brian.
I was just going to echo a lot of what Sheriff Heck said in terms of my intent either is also in no way to minimize the domestic violence and the victims who experience that. I think we go back, we talk a lot about the original intent of the registry being a crime is committed usually by somebody, an unknown perpetrator, and law enforcement can then use the registry to look at people who've committed similar crimes in the past, possibly identify a suspect. In the domestic violence situations, we have an identified perpetrator, right? So I think that's my piece too, is just more about fine tuning it, removing those folks for that particular reason, I guess. It wouldn't be needed to, they would already be known and an identified assailant or alleged perpetrator there, so.
Although one thing that's interesting, like I was just thinking about you and from that, and again, this is a little bit off of the purpose of the registry, but when you think about, you know, registry being tied to the community notification statute, if you've got a even level 1 offender, you can notify household members. So that's, I guess, one thing for domestic assault being included on the registry is a future partner is going to get that notice that this person has this history if they don't know that. So, you know, that's just kind of tied into the community notification part of it, but that could be part of, you know, why they would be included.
Well, and I think, Angie, you bring up the point that Representative Moeller brought up also, is that domestic abuse is not a registration offense. So it's kind of odd that you're trying to bring it in the back door, but not directly. So, and I don't think there'd probably be many people who would say that when you get into the discussion of the registry, there'll be lots of offenses that could be added to the registry too. And that's a legitimate issue.
Yeah, but and maybe though the fact that they have to start out being charged with false imprisonment in addition to the domestic kind of gets to the seriousness of the offense, I guess is what I'm saying. I don't know. I mean, I wrote the language, taking it out, I'm the one who came up with this. So it's not like I'm, you know, I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate with that part of it.
And Representative O'Neill.
Thank you. And I'm just trying to paint the path at the legislature, and those of you that have come and watched committee or testified in committee, you realize that some things go very, very quickly. And then when you have somebody, when you've got opposition, things slow way down. And many times, especially in a short session like we have coming up, they can get set aside and not really go very far. It could take, let's say, if we've got things that we're moving forward with that don't have just overwhelming support, either they won't move forward at all, or they will take years and fine tuning. So that's why I asked the question. And I think what Ashley said is really important. The fact that domestic violence and sexual violence sometimes and many times do intersect and have crossover. And the men that are perpetrating that are many times the same person. So those are all things that we'll discuss at the legislature. But if there is hesitancy or concern raised, those sections, those changes probably would be set aside. So I could see where there would be quite a bit of concern. I mean, I realize that we don't put domestic violence offenders on the registry directly. So that would have to be explained at the legislature. And then the legislature would have a discussion as to who do they want on the registry. So anyway, those are all different things to think about as we put together a report. And I'm just kind of giving you expectations of where it's coming.
Then somebody will propose adding domestic abusers to the registry.
Yes, that is my point. So you get where I'm going. I'm trying to be very delicate here, but I'm just letting you know the path forward.
No, we've had that happen in other sessions on other sections of the statute where the BCA has proposed a fix and then kind of lost on some other issues. So
yes.
Yeah, and I think that's the discussion that goes on with community notification too, is once you open the door to that, it's not necessarily fixes as much as it goes the other way and becomes even more extreme. Always
well,
have
and
to
in
take
that
into
sense,
account.
in that sense then of, you know, I know I talked about with the language, there was the false imprisonment separation, there was the separating the domestic assault in the false imprisonment statute itself. It seems like then, given that discussion, really we should focus on, if we're going to recommend something, just separating out the false imprisonment requiring the conviction, and maybe not reworking the false imprisonment language, because if you separate out domestic from that, then again, you know, does that kind of say it's not as big a deal? You know what I mean? kind of what we just talked about. So maybe focus on the should false imprisonment include same set of circumstances or not? Because if it's a bad false imprisonment, you would sure hope the prosecutor is gonna try to get that conviction. But
Okay. Any other areas? Sheriff Heck?
I just concur with Angie's notion that removing false imprisonment from the same set of circumstances seems like the best path forward to address this issue if it is going to be addressed at all.
I just concur with Angie and Sheriff Eck in that regard.
See if we have that language.
I would like to note for all of you while Mark looks for the language that I'm wearing my purple Viking victory dress today. So the
That
odds of
would-
me being in the office on a Monday and after Vikings victory are very, very low. So
That implies that they won yesterday.
they did. Yay.
So let's see if this is that language. Is that showing up?
The top part is, but the false imprisonment part is not. Oh, wait, no, it is. Yeah, it is. It's all showing up.
Yeah,
And
what
also,
this does is it removes it from the same set of circumstances and puts it alone as you need to be convicted or adjudicated delinquent. So,
and Mark, you don't have this language yet, but I messed around trying to work on the juvenile language. And if we were to propose both this and something with juveniles, it would look a little bit different because we would have to kind of put a section like this of false imprisonment kind of in each part of the statute, in the out of state part, in the federal part. And the juvenile language I sent to Olivia and Troy, even though we're not a subgroup. And I think Olivia was probably, and maybe Troy too, a little overwhelmed. I mean, it was a lot of language and I sent it out without the markup the first time. So just kind of a heads up that we'd probably have to do some kind of combining if we, of the language, if we propose anything on the juveniles too.
and this does include juveniles.
Right, I'm talking about when we talked about juvenile language that only requires juvenile registration for like EJJ or adult prosecution. I came up with some language or a draft for that, but I haven't really, beyond sending it to Stacy and Troy, that's the furthest it's gotten. And it was when I did that, because I had to kind of include similar language for out of state offenders and federal offenders, and I had to move the false imprisonment language to each part too, if that makes sense. So because for an out of state, you would only want them to have to register for a conviction for false imprisonment too, or for a federal offender. See what I'm saying? So the other paragraphs would have to be also amended. And then, like I said, combined if we propose anything on changing anything on the juveniles.
Yep. Representative O'Neill.
Thank you. So just switching quickly just to the juvenile, and then we can come back to this. Did the BCA, did they finish the database to say of the 38 juveniles that are currently on the registry? I know they can't go much beyond that. Did they let us know how many of those are EJJ or adult, certified adult?
No, Katie is still reviewing that list. It wasn't a part of the original poll. And so Katie is reviewing that, and then the data practices team will just verify that there is nothing that could lead somebody to conclude who these individuals are in the data, and then that will be sent out. So
And
we're hoping within at least the next couple of days.
My guess would be it's actually probably not a very large percentage, but that's just my guess based on what I've reviewed on juveniles, because I don't think we see all that many that are adult or EJJ necessarily. And when I was writing that language, I know we're going to go back to the other thing, but when I was working on that language, just with the frustration of trying to come up with language that worked and how it's going to be how it would be to kind of try to administer that. I started thinking it might make more sense if we're going to limit juveniles to do it based on offense convictions versus EJJ or adult prosecution, and just do it, pick the most serious offenses. Only because, kind of like we talked about this morning, you get into the whole, how are judges, different judges, different counties going to treat juveniles in the same situation. And would it be kind of more straightforward to just say juveniles above the age of, let's say 15, if you want to make it an age thing, who are convicted of, and then list the statutes that are the more serious statutes. It seems like that might be a cleaner way to address that issue of limiting the juveniles than doing the EJJ and adult prosecution. At least that's what I started thinking when I was working on that language. Because otherwise you're going to have to try to track if an out-of-state offender comes, and then you're going to try to figure out which of their, do they have an EJJ situation or do they have an adult prosecution? And if they do, was that kid from Hawaii prosecuted under that and convicted under that? Same with the feds. So just that, I think, is a lot harder than saying, is this Hawaii statute similar to one of these statutes that we require registration for juveniles? And was this juvenile 15 at the time they committed the offense? So I'm almost thinking it would make more sense to kind of, as we talked about this morning with the extensions, have something very clear that requires juvenile registration versus looking at the processes.
Yeah, and I think if I could talk again.
Yep.
Thanks. So I think my question was twofold. I wanted to see the 38 and essentially, I don't know if we're going to see like what crime they committed or what some kind of narrative of what had happened. For me personally, that would be helpful because it helps to paint a picture as to of the 38. That's why they're there. We're trying to figure out the kind of anecdotal things that we're hearing in this working group of 13-year-olds that are on the registry and now they're 16 and it was an age-related offense or something. So I'm just trying to parse that out, and that the solid information that comes from the BCA is really helpful for a couple different reasons. Not only to craft maybe a change, but just to know how many didn't land on it, how many, because we've had a lot of testimony and discussion here about stays of adjudication and all that kind of thing. So I'm just trying to have a better understanding of who's actually on it and why, and what was the path they got there, that sort of thing. The only thing go ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Representative O'Neill, go ahead. So what we will be able to provide, and this was what, and I guess this is a decision for the group if you would still like us to provide it this way. What we heard during last week's meeting was that folks did not want the data divided. So in two different sets, how many were EJJ, et cetera, versus the crimes that put them on the registry. So what we currently have and what we have sent to the chairs is essentially a list of what was done that warranted their registration. We don't have the actual criminal statute attached to it. Everything is de-identified. It is simply the actions that brought them into the judicial system and what they are registering for technically. We can share that now, but what we heard in the last meeting was that folks wanted to have it all in one piece as to whether that instance was, ended up in EJJ, that instance ended up, in any other scenario, adjudicated adult. And so I think it's up to the group how they would like to see it. But we do currently have the Excel spreadsheet with the actual description as best as it could be de-identified of what the victims experienced with these individuals.
Why doesn't it doesn't have the statutes? Or does it?
No, we pulled out the actual conviction statute. And
That
so,
would be helpful.
and I can talk to our data practices team about it. It might be kind of a decision as to how much information we can comfortably share and in what context. I am not a data practices expert, but essentially we have the crime that they committed, not by criminal code, just the description, and then some additional details. But that's what we have right now. And we're happy to share it however the group would prefer to see it.
Well, I think you could send out what you sent to the chairs to everyone, and then we can always add the other information. But I think if you can share the conviction offense, whether it's EJJ or adult or whatever, to me, that's, kind of a significant factor. If of the 38, 30 are on there for 5th degree crim sex, for example. I mean, I think that would be something good to know. And I know that's just 38 that are currently on there, but I don't know why, and I'm not a data practices expert, although I have been in the past. I mean, I don't know why you wouldn't be able to share a statute somebody was convicted under that wouldn't identify them.
Yeah, again, not a data practices expert, so I'm just gonna preface with that. But it might have also been the request that was made at the time that we provide what exactly was done, which may or may not necessarily align 100% with what they were convicted of.
Right.
And so there is that to take into account when we're looking at any kind of criminal history, is the difference between somebody's actual conviction and the actions that brought them into court in the first place. And so it is up to the group how they would prefer to see these items. We're happy to share the spreadsheet as it is now, or hold off until we're able to better delineate who went into EJJ or other judicial processes.
I just think given the time constraints, you should share what we have now and then add the other information if you can and get it out as soon as we can.
Okay, sounds good.
Troy, do you agree? I don't mean to be bossy.
Okay, Jim.
I have a question. Of the 38 that has been identified as juveniles on the registry, are those included those juveniles who would have been just charged directly as adults because they were over 16 and they were alleged to have been convicted or committed an offense that would go to prison. And my understanding is that there's an automatic, just file it as an adult in those cases. Do we know if those cases are included in the 38?
So the current count, and I should correct myself, it's 40, is only juveniles right now. So what we can give you is essentially a photo of the present status. We aren't looking at historical individuals or individuals who were once juveniles who are on this. We're just looking at who we have listed as juveniles presently.
Thank you.
Katrina.
Good afternoon. I appreciated Angie's comments in regards to the potential issues that would arise when it comes specific to EJJ youth. And I think that is why, when I first brought up the EJJ youth, I think from my perspective, it's cleaner to have just no juveniles on the registry, and really focus the registry more on those kids that we see that are, if we are going to, and we're not going to be, making recommendations like some states who, regardless of if you're certified as adult or you're processed through the adult system, if you're a juvenile when you commit the offense, not including those kids on the registry. If we're not going to go that far, I think then the EJJ population is a population that are technically still in the juvenile world. And so I think if it would be cleaner to not include EJJ youth on the registry because they are technically still juveniles and haven't had that adult sentence imposed on them. And so that is a way that would keep it cleaner for some of those transfer kids that would be potentially coming into our state. So that is another option.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you. I just have another question. I don't remember us talking about it, but has anyone done any research as to other states and what their lower limit of their POR is? Obviously ours is 10, which is very, very low, but has anyone done any research to find out what other states do as their low end number?
I have tasked our law clerk with that. I talked with her last week about a bunch of our issues, and she was going to try to do a very broad overview, like for example, saying 10 states don't require juveniles to register at all. 15 states require registration at this age, or whatever the ages are. And she was going to try to have something back to me, I think by the end of this week, maybe. So we will have that information. I provided her with Katrina had given me some information on juveniles, and I'd gotten some information from Stacy and maybe Brian on both adult and juveniles. And I provided that to the law clerk and then just talked with her kind of about how it would be helpful to have some really kind of a broad overview about what the other states are doing. So we should have that probably in some kind of table form by next week, I would think.
Thanks.
So the one thing I would add, and Katie was kind enough to share this anecdotally from her continuous review, the vast majority that she is seeing are just adjudicated. They are not EJJ, there's no special delineation. So she is not seeing a bunch of kids going through a separate process.
Representative Moeller.
Thanks. Sorry I'm late. I had another meeting I couldn't get out of, so I apologize if I'm not quite understanding what's happening. But when I joined in, it sounded like there is some data available, but it hadn't been determined yet whether or not those juveniles were EJJ or certified. You haven't gone through those cases. I can see Olivia shaking her head yes. And I think the question was, do we as a group want that information now before you're able to finish working out whether or not it's EJJ or certified? And I had mentioned this at the larger group meeting, I think too. I am opposed to that. Incomplete data can take on a life of its own at the legislature. And so even if we get more complete data later, I would prefer, and I don't know what the timelines are for you all to be able to finish that work, but I would prefer that you all share that data once it's completed, rather than having incomplete data that again can take on a life of its own and maybe a way that we don't want to see happen.
Yeah, we
I
are
see
happy to
Marion
share
shaking
the,
her head, nodding her head in agreement.
we're happy to share whatever format folks would prefer. We think that it'll be complete within the next couple of days. You know, whatever folks prefer is what we're happy to share or do.
If you can get it in a couple of days, I'm all for deferring to the legislature on, you know, what would be good with the data. I was just concerned because we've been talking about this for a while and we hadn't gotten it. And I just thought these are our last group meetings, I mean, maybe we'll have one more, I don't know. Small group meetings, I just thought it would be good to have that information for the group. But if it's only going to be a couple days and you can get the EJJ, maybe get the statutes that they were convicted under, then we might as well get it all out together if that makes more sense.
Sheriff Heck?
On the topic of juveniles, my concern as I've been listening to the conversation around this is that even in my experience, I would have to agree that the vast majority of victims that are victimized by juveniles are themselves juveniles. And my concern is that may very well be simply because that's who juveniles have access to. That is their available victim pool. A juvenile certainly is going to have a hard time victimizing an adult. So in my mind, the difficulty with placing juveniles on the registry or delineating between who should or who shouldn't is somehow trying to define, as this juvenile grows into adulthood and now has greater access to an expanded victim pool, is that the person that we need to have on the registry versus a juvenile who was exposed to some unfortunate circumstances, acted those out, has treatment, and now isn't a threat anymore. That's the biggest thing in my mind, is how do we separate out those who are going to grow into predatory offenders versus those who are going to be treated and not be an issue.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you. I thought this was a good time to remind those that are writing the report that you can also just ask the legislature to conduct a study and pay for it of the database, and have U of M or whatever research department do a deep dive and then do a report to the legislature if that is something that, you know, as Representative Mueller said, incomplete, inaccurate data or painted a picture of certain data that's not completely accurate takes on a life of its own, and then that becomes the narrative. We move very, very quickly at the legislature, as you know, and I think that would also be helpful as the report to the legislature. You recommend that. The other thing I was going to say too, talk about the state of adjudication change. When we talked about it previously, I had recommended that maybe we could do from the 12 months to 18 months, but I don't mean for like all circumstances. It would be just for the circumstance to allow that juvenile to be able to finish treatment. And so you can narrow that in the law if you want.
Katrina.
Thanks. So did I hear correct that there's now currently 40 juveniles on the registry? So there's been 2 added since we started this? Is that correct?
Yeah. So Karina, when we started, the first numbers that were pulled like on August 3rd when this first convened. And at that time, there were 2 pending offenders. So in the time from then until when we pulled the list of the juveniles that I've been working on, 2 people moved from pending into registration because we got the proper documentation came in or review was done, or I don't know if it was an out-of-state offender or if they were in-state offenders, but whatever, they went from pending into registration. So we could log in today and pull a different, and there could be 1 more. I have no idea. But as of that day, of the 3rd, we had 38. When we went to pull it 2 months later, there was 2 more.
Okay, great. That's helpful. And then If you don't mind, I just have a quick question for Representative O'Neill, just following up on our state of adjudication. So I just have clarity to make sure I'm thinking properly. Representative O'Neill, are you thinking, when you're talking about specifically the state of adjudication and narrowing that, are you thinking specific to youth who have to go through sex offender treatment, or are you thinking more specific, more broadly in regards to treatment in general?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I don't know if you were part of the couple of meetings that we talked about extending from 12 months to 18 months, the option of stay of adjudication for juveniles. The legislature had expanded that from 6 months to 12 months, and my recommendation was to recommend to the legislature to expand it to yet another 18 months, so the additional 6 months, for the purpose of sex offender treatment, because we had heard repeatedly that sex offender treatment can take up to 18 months, and it's very difficult to know if they have been successful or in compliance when the treatment goes beyond what the stay is allowed. And so there was a disconnect. My recommendation was to fix the disconnect for the purpose of finishing sex offender treatment. And then I think someone else had mentioned too that sometimes you need 6 months even after you complete treatment to know, how stable are they and was it effective, and all those sorts of things, the follow-up. So someone had mentioned instead of 18 months going to 24 months for that purpose, but just for the purpose of extending sex offender treatment and follow-up.
Perfect, thank you. That was helpful. I had, I wasn't at the last work group meeting, so I listened to the recording. And so that was the one question I had, if we were narrowing it, or were you thinking more broadly around states of adjudication? So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Brian.
I was just going to ask, in the BCA information, the 40 that you're talking about, Olivia and Katie, is it also going to be included if they're at 10-year registration or lifetime registration out of that group? Just as a kind of total numbers, who's on lifetime and who's not?
No, it is just going to be the crimes that they were adjudicated for. And currently what we have is a description and not the actual citation. But what I'm hearing is that folks would also like to see that, and that they're on the registry. So just look at it as like a snapshot of a moment in time.
Could that be added? That would be very helpful, I think, just as a who's on lifetime out of that 40 and who's not.
So that would be a restart yet again on the third time for this list of people. But I think, Brian, to address that, depending on how Judy, our data practice attorney, ends up adjusting it or adjusted it, when I went through and reviewed the juveniles, you could probably figure out who would be a lifetime offender or potentially a lifetime offender based on the rows that they would have. Offender number 5 might have 2 different rows, and if it calls it out, it would show, well, if the charges could stay in there, you'd be able to figure that out, I guess. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to figure out. It's just going to look like multiple victims.
But it says on the website, the registration period, right? 10-year or lifetime or the end date, that kind of thing. So matching that up with those 40.
So the problem
again,
with
not
that,
identifying
Brian,
any individuals, but just as a group.
yeah. So again, I could go back and I could start over on the data request again and go back to the first offender and query to get that. The problem is the offenders that have more than one registration, each registration holds a registration period in the way the system was built. So it's just not as, yes, we display one for you. You are using an interface that goes to a database that is pulling that out. It is not the same thing as when we go into the database, there's, for the offender with 5 different offenses, they have 5 different end dates. And the system has to figure out, has a way of figuring that out to display for you.
Okay, well, I think it would be helpful information if we could do it. I don't know if other people agree or not, but that's just one take. But just to follow up on what Sheriff Heck said too, just about most juveniles, we've talked about it, victimized folks that they know and a more limited victim pool. And how do we find out who, may broaden that or go on to be an adult offender. And of course, it's not an exact science by any means, but I think maybe getting into that off-ramp situation again, even if juveniles remain on the registry. Not that I favor juveniles not being in the registry at all, but if they remain, that off-ramp situation and sort of a risk assessment process to potentially identify folks that are more likely to continue as adults or more predatory type stranger offenses, those kinds of things.
So the one thing that I do just want to add is that folks are mentioning a timeline and that they want the data faster. We have certain data points, but every new data point is a new start at the very beginning of the list in another review. And so if we want the full picture and we want all of these data points, then we're going to have to decide what we want sooner, if we're willing to piecemeal things out, etc. So because it is a manual review of each and every individual, each and every situation. So I would ask that folks provide what they would prefer, what they want, and what needs to be immediately provided versus what folks are okay without having or waiting for, because the manual review takes time and that pushes back the time by which we can give you a full picture.
Jim.
Just another question on these 40 juveniles, and I hear things and I just want to follow it up. Of these 40 juveniles, Olivia and Kate, you'd identified them because there's some language in the disposition that says they were adjudicated. Is that my understanding?
No, so this is a snapshot in time of the registry. So looking at the registry, we're seeing, Katie is seeing individuals at a certain age. And so it's just a snapshot moment in time right now.
So you identified
for further details. Yes. And so then for additional details, Katie needs to go into the file, review the file, pull the data that is within it. Each and every file is by case, I believe. And so it is a manual review of each and every situation.
Okay.
So a simplified way here is that it's a list of everybody on the registry who is under the age of 18, regardless of whether they're certified as an adult, EJJ, or pure juvenile.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Anything? Yes. Representative O'Neill.
So in the database, in the POR, do you see what court district that they came from? Like the 10th judicial where I'm at, or?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I'm just trying to figure out
yes.
how bad. Just yes. Yes. So look at it as just yes. I'm going to make this significantly more complicated trying to work through it in my brain as opposed to just yes.
Okay. Are you going to be including the judicial district from which they were sentenced in the data?
Right.
Okay, so this is where we get into some of the data practices guru stuff, because what you then start narrowing down to with all of this data is their conviction, their age, and now you're looking at their location. And so there is a gray area line that we begin encroaching upon that honestly is significantly more data practices expertise than I have, that we just need to be aware of, because that for some, that is going to narrow them to a very small field in a very small location area. And so we need to kind of splice through how far we can go before we're now helping identify individuals. And I don't know that that line is static. My understanding is it is a very gray area depending upon the other factors being requested. But just know that we're starting to encroach on significant details that can aid in the identification of individuals, from my understanding. And that is where our data practices experts begin to get heartburn and hernias and all sorts of other concerns. So just know that that is out there.
And I think this might be a good time to perhaps get some clarification from Karen on some of those stats you provided. I think you wanted to take another look at them to see about the EJJ and the certification and the juveniles. Is that true?
Yeah, I think I still wanted to look back at the last set, and now I can't even remember what the issue was. That's why I'd asked you to set time with us between these meetings so we can get our data story straight. Because the last point that had been raised was about the use of stays of adjudication, and I think there was some collective memory. I'd already pulled that, but I went and looked, and we'd only pulled it for the 243-166 offenses, which has nothing to do with the registrable offenses question that was raised. So I think there's still a lot that the court can provide. The problem is, as you know, what we give you is just the pool of numbers of how many people might possibly have been registry eligible, but it will do nothing to shed any light on who these 40 are, I think, in terms of, even if I can sort by district and county. But I mean, it still might help. And I think that you and Olivia and I still need to sit down, go through the spreadsheet, figure out what questions we think that the court has answered and not answered, and finish our piece. So,
yeah, and I think one of the questions, you had pulled back that data because it showed a real lack of information on some of the judicial districts, and that was why.
yeah, well, my recollection is that based on the way we had pulled it, I think she had looked for use of like an EJJ granted code, which turned out wasn't as reliable as we'd hoped. So we need to look at the disposition tab, because we can tell there whether both a juvenile and an adult sentence were entered. So we have other ways to sort of proxy whether EJJ was granted in a case than this code that was absent. So once she pointed that out, the numbers I just said were unreliable. So we'll get you better numbers. But yeah, I'm sorry, it's just hard to get time to get back to the data piece when we spend so much quality time together as it is during a given week. So,
and just know that from our perspective, and this is something that, you know, I'm sure Karen and the courts bump into too, is there's a difference between summary data and the collection of numbers per district and all of the other little identifiers that can help add up who somebody is. And so that is kind of the gray area that we are going to begin bumping into, just FYI, as we ask for more data points per individual.
yeah, for us, for juvenile, it's summary is all you're gonna be able to get under our rules, whether it was a public case or a confidential case. So
Yeah, and that it's unrelated to these 40 current juveniles, because the data you were providing actually are people who were juveniles at the time, but maybe adults now. So it's probably a cleaner set of.
well, yes and no, because the way that the court manages juveniles who move into the adult, whether that's because their EJJ is revoked or they're certified, they will have two completely separate cases in our system. They will have a juvenile case and they will have an adult case. So if you ask us to pull data, it may be that the same person is represented in both of those sets, depending on whether we're pulling original disposition, final disposition. So that's just the challenge with summary data. That's why, at least in all of them, we've tried to count people as well as cases, but I don't think I had her do that, is to do that against the adult and the juvenile sets, because you might also see some, basically the number of people should be less than the number of cases. But yeah, I know I need to get back to this. We should just set some time, Mark. Just force me to give this a couple hours this week, and let's just finish pulling what we need to pull.
Representative Moeller.
Thanks. I wanted to get back to the question of what additional information, if any, are we going to ask the BCA to get? Because I hear the concerns about the timing, about having complete data, about getting more data that Brian suggested. And I want to make sure that they know what they're tasked with doing and that we understand what those timelines are. And I guess the question I have is for you, Brian. I'm curious to know whether it's 10 years or lifetime, like how will that help us make decisions? I like to have all the data before I make decisions, but I want to understand how that might be something that could be useful to the recommendations we're making in the report.
I guess for me, it's another piece of information. It not necessarily just related to the juveniles, but adults too. I think we're not going to be able to get that information. I think we talked about that this morning. Just how many, one of the things for me about the off ramp specifically is regarding lifetime registrants. One of the things we talked about this morning was that there are a segment of the registration folks that have committed one offense and get lifetime registration based on the statutory language and what they're actually convicted of. So getting an idea of those numbers, how many people are we talking that would could benefit from this off-ramp situation? If we have 18,000 on the registry and 4,000 of them are lifetime registrants based on one offense, just for informational purposes, I think, just like you said, having complete data, and if it was not too difficult to extract that information, I think it just provides a fuller picture of everything. So that's the reason I asked for it.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I'll just say that I'm not sure for the 40 juveniles that gives the same kind of information you're looking for. But I don't know if that's the case or not. Like, I guess I'm feeling like, let's get done with those 40, figure out if they're EJJ or certified, get that information. And then if there's something else we can do to look into how serious those consequences are, let's do that. But I'm not sure that, but I could be wrong. So correct me if I'm wrong about that.
I agree. If we need that, it sounds like you're almost done with the initial data set, Katie and Olivia, a couple days or something. Get that information to people, the crimes, whatever we need to do. And if, it's not too difficult to look into it again, or either that's lifetime or 10-year or whatever other data points we want to ask about can be followed up on later too. Yeah, for sure.
And I would say if it's easy to do with the EJJ and the certification information to get the statutes they were convicted under, I think that would be good. But if that's something that's going to take longer, then I think just do the EJJ and certification for now.
Representative O'Neill.
I have a question for Karen. She would come back. Is it possible for the courts to give us information as to how often stays of adjudication have been done by district and possibly by county? For example, the 10th has got, I don't know, 6 or 7 different counties in it, specifically for juveniles that have been charged with an offense that would land them on the registry.
Yep, I think that's exactly the data set I was going to go back and pull. And I think, Angie, I'd asked you that one clarifying question. Do you want just, I can't even remember which list. Well, at any rate, yes. Yes, I think that is currently on my list. So you want
just registration offenses.
Yeah, and here's the thing is it gets difficult if you try to parse it by which disposition was connected to which offense, because believe it or not, we do get mixed dispositions on a case. So one count might have, an adjudication and one count might have a stay. So it would be easier if I can just like look for cases that have a registrable offense that received a stay of adjudication on that offense. And then do you want to know just the initial use of that? Or then like, do we also want to know sort of rates of revocation? It gets much more complicated if we're looking at, did it become an adjudication later versus a dismissal later? We can try to do that, but that is definitely pulling a different point in time.
So for my interest, I'm less interested in what happened after, like if it didn't work and they were adjudicated. I'm more interested in the narrative that's been brought forward that many of the, especially outstate counties, don't use it at all, don't know to use it. And so I want to know through the data that you have, if in fact there are, 90% of the outstate counties in those jurisdictions, those judicial districts, don't use it, didn't know about it. That seems to be the bigger concern. If they use it and it works, great. If they use it and it fails, they're adjudicated. Okay. I just want to know which judicial districts are actually using it or not.
That is much easier because then we just go by initial disposition on those charges. So I can certainly do that.
Thank you.
So, and then just to go back to that one question, Karen, on, on October 29th, you provided the EJJ granted or not granted, or certification granted or not granted. And I think the simple question on that was, did you have to run that report again versus, because that's the one you asked us not to share yet. And that was broken down by judicial district.
Yes, and I believe the issue with that data set is, wasn't that everything as opposed to just registration offenses? So I think there were two issues with that data set. It was overbroad and it had that potential issue with the granted set.
Or the other way around, that it was not inclusive enough, I think was the reason
I think it was too inclusive. I think
it was
that-
everything, right? It was just kind of basic stats on EJJ and cert per, statewide or per county or district or whatever. But then the question was, is this just registration offenses? And we hadn't done that narrowing. So if I'm hearing it right, what we are going for now is the EJJ and cert numbers and stays of adjudication. Do we want to drill down by county and all that? Probably. And
It sounds like Representative O'Neill would like it drilled down by county.
and then all on just registrable offenses as opposed to all offenses. Using that sort of list one, as we call it. Okay.
And so to go back to the request from the BCA, just to be sure that we're actually pulling what folks want and what folks want immediately, or in the nearer future than not, I should say. Folks want the detail of, so currently we have essentially a number that is assigned to the individual on the registration. We then have their relationship with the registered individual, as nondescript as we can be while providing folks with some details that were requested. Then we have a description of what led to the registration. What I'm hearing is that folks want the actual charge that they were adjudicated for. And then what I'm also hearing is that they want the detail of EJJ versus certified, et cetera. And so we will work on trying to add those. Do folks also want the jurisdiction, or for us to at least try? There may be a line here where we have to choose which data points we want to make sure that folks are not identifiable.
And throw in the registration period if you can too, just as an additional data point.
Okay.
If possible, as long as we're asking for stuff.
Katrina.
Thanks, Norm. One thing that I've really appreciated about the chairs is that they have been trying to remind us that policy decisions can continue to be, or policy recommendations can continue to be made even in light of potential gaps in data or unavailability of data. And I think because this is a snapshot in time of these juveniles, and there are 40 juveniles on the registry, and it does not encompass the amount of people who are on the registry who are originating of a juvenile offense who are now adult, I just really encourage us to, I'm the first person to say that our decisions need to be rooted in data. But I also think the research and the evidence that we've been able to show in regards to the intent of the registry and how that is not applicable to juveniles as well as it is applicable to adults, I just encourage us to really lean into that research because when we know that, I'm repeating things we've already heard, right? That juveniles, their population that they typically are involved in the behavior with is somebody that they know. It's not specific to, what the intent of the registry is. And I think when we're thinking about the kids, I think, we can really root some of these conversations in the research because I think the data is limited in regards to what we have. And I would hate for us to take a snapshot of data at one time that's not inclusive of all the kids who started as a juvenile are now an adult. And have us make decisions based on that snapshot of data when there's also a large amount of research out there that shows that the registry is not increasing public safety. It isn't deterring kids from committing additional crimes in regards to this or participating in this behavior in the first place. And it's not going specifically to the direct intent of the registry. I just really encourage us to think holistically about this because I think there is enough evidence to show that kids potentially should not be on the registry.
Anything else there? Okay. We're getting pretty close here. Do we
I
want
don't
to?
know.
Oh,
Yeah, I mentioned this earlier. I think this was before Representative Moeller was on, but I mentioned that when I was working on the language for EJJ and adult prosecution, that it occurs to me with the administrative issues that it might be cleaner to come up with, if there's going to be a proposal of limiting versus eliminating juveniles, like let's say an age of 15. I'm just throwing that out there because that I think is one of the EJJ ages or adult prosecution ages, and maybe 14, but let's say we go 15. And I wonder if it may make sense to come up with a list of the more serious, sex offenses and see if we can come up with any kind of language that might limit juveniles in that way versus the EJJ adult prosecution way. It's not something that, it's something the feds talk about. I know I know, again, how much we care about the federal requirements or not, but I think they're 15 and there are like descriptions of the types of sex offenses that they say should require registration. I think maybe with force, violence, whatever. So, I mean, I could try to, kind of look through ours and maybe it's even a matter of, looking at the offenses that require lifetime registration. The age ones wouldn't make sense for juveniles, but, maybe some of those are the more serious offenses that might require juvenile registration or something like that. But I just wonder what other people think about that idea of maybe limiting it in that way versus trying to deal with the whole EJJ adult prosecution way. Anyone? legislators, do you think it makes any difference?
Jim,
I would support anything where we could see some data. And I do think that there's going to be a classification of cases, although I don't think there are a lot, that where kids have done something pretty bad that would warrant registration. I'm not saying what I know what that actually is, but I'm not saying that it isn't out there. But I just don't think it's in the numbers. I think there's certainly this belief that, and I believe it's a false assumption, and it's my belief that just a kid that gets caught up in something like, who gets caught up in a sex offense young, who's sort of in that area of whether or not they're experimenting or they're doing something really, really stupid. That they're not sort of in this predator language that certainly came out of the 1990s. And we seem to be hanging on to that when the social science research is telling us otherwise. That's really what I want. I mean, I've made some statements about things. Will live and die by the data. I just want to see some data. And I think that if we can get this broken down in the way that Angie says, I'm certainly going to look at it. I just like to see some data.
Representative Moeller.
I just had a follow-up question, and is part of the thinking, Angie, because of for other out-of-state convictions or adjudications, I guess, in the case of juveniles, like trying to figure out if we limited it to only EJJ and certified cases here for juveniles, then what do you do about those out-of-state?
That was part of it. When I was writing the language, I guess that's what got me thinking about it and knowing kind of what the federal requirements have said. But that's what got me thinking about it, because I had to write separate language for, in-state federal offenses, out-of-state offenses. And the language I wrote was something like, a convicted or adjudicated under a similar statute in, another state. But then it gets into this whole thing, where you have to like, does the other state even have something like EJJ? I think most states have adult prosecution, but yeah, trying to do that analysis, I think, is a lot harder than just saying this person was 15 and they got a first-degree crim sex conviction, or a conviction for using a weapon while they sexually assaulted somebody, or a conviction for using violence or force or whatever while they sexually assaulted someone with penetration. You know what I mean? So it's much more easy to go to another state or the feds and see that kind of conduct and match that up with the serious conduct that we would require here, theoretically, than to try to go to other states and the feds. So that would be the biggest issue. But I think even from an in-state standpoint, we get that same concern of what are different judges doing, what are different attorneys doing, depending on what kind of representation people have. You know what I mean? And that's kind of determining which juveniles have to register. And I realize that can still be manipulated by how the conviction is, but it just seems so much murkier. I don't know. This was just my thinking as I was trying to draft language to do the EJJ adult prosecution stuff.
Yeah, and I think to Jim's point, having the data from the BCA on some of those things will help us figure out which recommendation to make. And I want to say, Katrina, I hear you too, and I've heard Patty loud and clear and others in the group talking about juveniles being on the registry at all. And I think that the political reality, I mean, if the report makes that recommendation or there's a minority report to that effect, I think that that's fine. I think the political reality of being able to completely eliminate juveniles from the registry is probably unlikely. And so the question is, do we want to come up with another alternative that we might have an actual chance of getting passed or not? I mean, and I think that's part of the question for this group is, do you want to have some kind of alternative or make that recommendation for just no juveniles and see where it goes. And I don't know if Marion was going to speak to that too. She put her hand up, so.
Yes, Representative O'Neill.
Yes, so Representative Mueller and I have talked offline about this very topic. So I think that there would be room, I think, and a case to be made at the legislature to move the age from 10 to something. I don't know what that number is, which is why I asked about what other states do. But I think a case could be made that a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, I don't know how far you want to go up, should not be on the POR. As far as which crimes, I would caution, again, with all my work I've done in the last decade about sexual assault and all of that, I would caution including only violent crimes, crimes using force or coercion. Well, I shouldn't say, I'll say force, I won't say coercion. My concern is that when a child is involved in the recipient of the abuse, it's usually much more of a grooming behavior that happens, which is more the coercion side of it. But I don't think there's a high prevalence, and correct me if I'm wrong, of using dangerous weapons to assault a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old. It's much more subtle. So like we're going to play a game, and all the coercion that happens. So that being said, the older actor, the perpetrator, could fall into that predatory category when there are multiple victims. They kind of learn how to do it, so to speak. But I wouldn't pin it on force, or, you think of Crim Sex 1, Crim Sex 2. I don't think that's going to get very far at the legislature, just understanding grooming behavior.
And I was not limiting it to those. I was just throwing out some examples. I think that if we did it that way versus the EJJ or adult prosecution way, I think we would have, as a group, kind of look at the crim sex crimes and see, and maybe it is, any first through fourth, at age 15 or above or something like that. Maybe you don't break down subdivisions, but I was just throwing that out as an example. But I certainly appreciate your point about that, dealing with sexually dangerous people all the time. That's very common. That is just a manipulation issue.
Yes. Thanks. Yep, that was my only point, is that if we're going to go down that road, understand how those acts actually happen, which we all do, just pointing the obvious, I guess.
Katrina.
I appreciate Representative Muller's and Representative O'Neill's comments, because I think it's helpful for us to know the potential areas of success we may have. And, I'm always a believer that you advocate for, you work towards the best outcomes for youth. And I think that there is an opportunity to have a policy statement in regards to what the consensus is, or where we can come to agreements in regards to juveniles. And if that is something we can't get through the legislature, and there's other areas that we think we could get success, I think delineating those out to at least get better outcomes in the areas that we have consensus and we think we can get through. But I think it's really important to also have that larger statement in regards to what is the long-term goal and what would we like to see. and maybe what we think we can get done now. I think it's really important to say both of those things because it at least conveys where we are at as a state, even if we can't successfully get those things through the legislature. Us as a work group can at least make those recommendations. But I really appreciate the transparency and the honesty around, potentially what we could and could not get through, because I think it's helpful in us just thinking moving forward how this looks in actual actionable items, and not just in a report.
Jim.
I just sort of would point people to look at the code. There are, in criminal sexual conduct in the 3rd degree and criminal sexual conduct in the 4th degree, subdivision 1, parent A, in both of those statutes are 2 specific offenses that only a juvenile can commit. The complainant is under 13 years of age and the actor is no more than 36 months older. By definition, the actor cannot be more than 16 years of age. It would be interesting to know how many of those offenses we have. And it doesn't delineate it, just other than it was penetration or was contact. It doesn't delineate what that offense is, but that is specifically we have in our criminal code a specific provision that only a juvenile can be convicted of. And I think we should be aware of that as we're looking at this data.
Representative Moeller.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'll just note though that some of those changes were made just to go into effect September 15th. So there were other provisions with age differentials in the previous law, but the ones that are in law now are so new that I'm assuming that nobody's on the registry, at least with those age differentials, because that just went into effect September 15th. So just wanted to make that point, even though I know there's prior to that, there were other provisions that are based on age. The ages were just different.
Jim?
The statutory subdivisions that I cite have been there ever since I've been practicing.
We changed the age though for the victims, and then the age differentials changed also down to 36 months. There was 48 months before, and it was 14 for the age of victims. So that's what I'm talking about. What
I understand
changed.
it was on that work, but I don't think these subdivision 1 parent A's in 1 and 2 were changed. And there's always been in the code those provisions that only
I
a
see what
juvenile
you're
can
saying.
be convicted, not
Yeah.
an adult.
Okay. Anything else here? Did we want to give our visitor an opportunity to speak if she wishes?
Fine with me.
Okay. If you wish to, you can raise your hand. Otherwise, we'll move on. Okay. Any other areas for discussion at this time? I guess we're waiting on some variations on that, the juvenile. And we may have some consensus on the false imprisonment, but we'll see how that flies with more discussion.
Again, I can kind of take a look at, try to for my thoughts of more about what might be an idea for the other juvenile language, but, and I can also share what I did with the EJJ. I'll talk to Stacy and Troy on Monday, and I'm happy to share kind of what I came up with already as far as EJJ goes and the adult prosecution goes. But like I said, as I was doing it, I'm like, oh boy, this is gonna be hard to manage.
So we do have a method subgroup tomorrow morning, and we have next Tuesday. Remember, it's not on Wednesday, but next Tuesday is the whole group meeting.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Have a good weekend. Oh, wait, I'm going to be there tomorrow morning. Forget it. See you tomorrow morning. Bye.